Hello, viewers, welcome to the mystery of another new movie. With the increasing reliance of humans on technology in today's world, people in the future may use robots to look like humans with artificial intelligence for all their tasks. But what if robots feel like humans, and he continues to meet the physical needs of the people? Today we will see the 2009 science fiction movie, Lifelike. There is a twist at the end of the movie that will fool you. You keep thinking, well, the whole movie made me stupid for a while. At the beginning of the movie, we see Sophie and her husband. They were taking an old sofa to their apartment. Sophie and her husband were quite happy in their married life. They lived a very ordinary life. But Sophie's husband's father was a very rich businessman and he had a very big company. But for some special reason, Sophie's husband did not live with her father. He lived a very normal life with Sophie. One day, Sophie's husband learns that her father is dead and writes off all her property, business, and commerce in Sophie's husband's name. From now on, Sophie's husband will have to look after her father's company. That's why they come back to a much bigger house left by Sophie's husband's father, although they lived in a small apartment. But Sophie was not happy in this luxurious life, because she was used to living a very ordinary life. But Sophie had no choice but to accept it. 2 servants were working in their house, and Sophie fired them on the first day. Sophie loved to do her work by herself. She did not want anyone to do his work. But Sophie's husband doesn't like it at all. He said the employees should not have been fired at all, because they can't take care of such a big house by themselves. But Sophie wants to do her work by herself. Her husband's life had changed with such a big responsibility in her father's business, and now all the responsibility of the huge company falls on her husband. He is very worried about all this. Meanwhile, Sophie could not take care of the house alone. Sophie's husband reported the matter to a colleague. Her husband's colleague gives her a great solution. He tells Sophie's husband that a scientist is working for their company. That scientist recently created human-like robots. The robots he created are so human that it is impossible to tell whether they are human or robots. The robots created by that scientist can do all the work that humans do, and they needed someone who could do all the housework. This time, Sophie's husband brings Sophie with him. Sophie's husband tells Sophie to choose one of these robots, whom they will take to their home for work. They want to take a robot named Henry with them. The scientist who was there told George, Sophie's husband, and Sophie that the robot was not harmful. They are very useful for people. These robots will be forced to do whatever people tell them. To prove it, Henry licked Sophie's husband's shoes. This proves that these robots have no willpower of their own. He is bound to do whatever people tell him. This time, Sophie and Sophie's husband bring Henry to their house. Henry was doing everything from cooking their meals. He used to do all the household chores very easily. When Sophie's husband talked to Henry answered all her questions in a very nice way. Sophie's husband starts liking Henry. He begins to share everything with Henry. Sophie, on the other hand, found Henry very strange at first. But over time she began to like Henry. Sophie begins to have a good time with Henry when her husband is away from home for office work. As if the two became very good friends, Sophie began reading her favorite book with Henry. The main purpose of making this robot Henry was to make his owner happy and obeys all his words. And only when its owner is happy will the robot Henry be happy. Sophie and her husband had a lot of trouble in their lives. But after the robot Henry came to their house, everything seemed to be back to normal. Then one day Sophie wants to know about love and feelings from Henry. Henry gives Sophie a beautiful explanation of the feeling of love. Meanwhile, Sophie's husband was so busy looking after his father's business that he could not give her time. Sophie's husband noticed several times that Sophie was having a good time with Henry, and she was much happier with Henry. And that's why Sophie's husband is jealous of Henry, although he knew that this Henry robot is not a human being. And that's why Sophie's husband started disliking Henry. But Sophie, on the other hand, began to see Henry in the public eye. Sophie is fascinated by Henry's human-like feelings and Henry's human-like conversations. And these are the ones that Sophie's husband didn't like at all. He tries to convince Sophie that he is not a human but a robot. And that's exactly how they should treat Henry. Sophie's husband forbids Sophie to use Henry as a human. The scientist who made Henry was the one who told them the way this robot will be used. He will start to think about itself the way. In other words, if you treat Henry as a human being, he will start thinking of himself as a human being. But Sophie refused to listen to her husband, because this robot Henry was like a human to him. One night Sophie woke up to hear some noise. She comes out of the house without finding Henry in his house, and Sophie sees Henry lying in the garden. Then when she comes to Henry, she realizes this Henry is dreaming. But a robot couldn't dream. Then Sophie's husband came and took Henry inside the house. And that's why Sophie's husband calls scientist George home. After examining George Henry, He told them that there was no problem with Henry, and it was a very minor problem, which is in all types of computers or robots. Sophie tells the scientist that she saw Henry dreaming. Sophie says she has been with Henry for several days. She treated her like a human being, which is probably why Henry began to think of himself as human. Then Sophie's husband gets very angry with Sophie, because it was all Sophie's fault. He tells Sophie not to treat Henry as a human being anymore, because Henry was a robot who had no feelings. That's why of this Sophie doesn't like her husband at all. They were both very angry. Sophie's husband then calls Henry to her, and forbids Henry to spend time with Sophie. The next day, Henry tells Sophie that her husband forbade her to talk to him. Sophie is furious with her husband, and she left this house. After Sophie leaves, Henry begins to refer to Sophie's husband. The problem that is going on between Sophie and her husband is not happening at all for herself. These problems have started among them since they came to this new house, because Sophie and her husband moved away from each other, couldn't give each other time. Sophie, meanwhile, begins to like Henry so much that she is always thinking of him, and she starts dreaming about Henry. In the dreams, she became very close to Henry. This Henry was so attractive that Sophie's husband also felt attracted to Henry. When Sophie was not at home, suddenly became intimate with Sophie's husband, Henry. But then Sophie's husband gets very upset about this, although he hides his words from Sophie. But by then Sophie had become very fond of Henry. One day Sophie was spending time with Henry, feeling like a human to Henry's Sophie. He told Sophie that he loved Sophie. Sophie is terrified when she hears about Henry, because Henry started behaving like a complete human being. Sophie tells Henry to leave. Sophie then shares it with her husband. Sophie's husband went home and slapped her, and Henry switched off and shut him down. This time Sophie's husband called the scientist George and asked him to take Henry away from their house. And they don't need this humanoid robot, because this humanoid robot Henry was destroying their lives. But by then Henry had completely changed. He realized that George was coming to destroy him, and he begged Sophie to let him stay in the house, because he started liking Sophie, and inside him now felt like a human being. He also told Sophie that he had become intimate with her husband, and they both admit that they were attracted to Henry. Now they plan to return Henry to the scientist and return to normal life as before. Then when the scientist came to take Henry, Henry was not obeying anything like before. And then comes the biggest plot twist of the movie. From the beginning of the movie, Henry never looked like a robot. He always seems to look like a human being, because this Henry was a real man, not a robot. And that's what scientist George did. That was trying to make humans robots. He was trying to make humans the perfect robot, and he wanted to design people in such a way that people would make no mistakes and obey all orders given to them. And it was being done not on a robot but on a living person. And because of the brainwashing of those people, they think of them as robots. George started brainwashing Henry when he was very young, and from the beginning, he says to Henry that he is not a human but a robot. But making humans robots was not so easy. When this Henry starts living with Sophie and her husband, all her human feelings come back, like dreaming of Henry or feeling love for Sophie. These were all human feelings, and that's why Sophie and her husband began to feel attracted to Henry, because he was not a robot but a human being. To find out, the police rescued everyone in the company who was brainwashed into robots. George lost his mind when he saw his experiment being destroyed. He shot and killed 2 police officers who came to arrest him. He was trying to kill Sophie and her husband, but Henry saves them. Then he kills George. But Henry suffers so much from this that he commits suicide. He leaves Sophie and her husband forever. A few years later, Sophie and her husband named their son Henry, as if Henry is always alive in their memory. And the movie ends here. See you soon with the secrets of any new movie. Stay tuned by subscribing to the channel.